There was a small room at the back of a monastery in Tuscany, where only men who had sworn eternal silence before 7 witnesses could enter. In that room, there was a cabinet, and inside that cabinet, there was a triple drawer, locked with 3 different keys, guarded by 3 monks who could never, under penalty of death, meet at the same time of day. And inside that drawer, protected by layers of dark velvet, lay pages. Just pages. Yellowed sheets from centuries of humidity, with faded ink, with various handwriting in Greek, in Aramaic, in ancient Latin. Pages that contained a single thing, a thing so small it could fit in a sentence, a thing so great that, if pronounced aloud in the streets of Europe, it would collapse like a house of cards, 1600 years of spiritual empire. These pages exist. They are not legend. They are not the invention of adventure novels. They have been catalogued, archived, mentioned in secret records, alluded to in correspondence between cardinals. And today, part of these pages is in the archives of the Vatican Apostolic Library, part is scattered across museums in Israel, part has been missing since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, and part probably will never be seen again, because it was burned by order of men whose names history decided to forget. What was written on those pages, my dear viewer, was the same thing that a young Jew from Amsterdam, working alone in a cold attic in 1656, discovered without ever having had access to that cabinet. The same thing that the Dead Sea Scrolls, accidentally found in a cave in the Judean desert in 1947, would come to confirm 3 centuries later. The same thing that, even today, the most honest priests whisper to themselves when no one is listening. The same thing that you perhaps have silently suspected without the courage to pronounce it aloud, while looking at the image of a golden Christ on a white wall. The discovery was this: the man from Galilee and the Lord of the altars may be 2 different people. If these words sent a little shiver down your spine, if they awakened in you an ancient unease, a suspicion that has long resided in some deep layer of your memory, then you are exactly where you should be. You are at the starting point of a journey that few dare to take to the end, because this journey, viewer, has no return ticket. Once you hear what comes next, once these facts, these documents, these arguments settle in your mind, you will no longer be able to look at a cross with the same eyes. And perhaps this, no matter how painful it may seem at first, is exactly what was missing for your faith. If you have faith, to finally cease being an inherited legacy and become for the first time a truth earned, I need you to meet a man, one single man for now, because this whole story begins with him, and it is in his shadow that we will walk in the next blocks. The name of this man, written in the birth register of the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam on November 24, 1632, was Baruch. Baruch means, in Hebrew, blessed. It was a name of hope. It was the name a father gives to a son when he believes that this son will be the pride of his lineage, the glory of his community, the wise man who will enlighten his people. And during the first 23 years of his life, Baruch Spinoza walked exactly in that direction. He was the brightest child in the Hebrew school, the most promising young man in the rabbinical seminary, the student who made the older masters fall silent, because his questions were deeper than the answers they knew how to give. But something happened to Baruch. He read too much, and he read things that no one should have allowed him to read. He read Maimonides, the great medieval rabbi who tried to reconcile Jewish faith with Greek philosophy. He read Ibn Rushd, the Averroes of the Muslims, who wrote in Cordoba about the eternity of the world. He read Descartes, the Frenchman who had just proposed that one should doubt everything, including one's own body, to reconstruct the truth from the beginning. He read the Gospels in Greek, comparing verse by verse. He read the prophets in Hebrew, noticing the contradictions between them. He read the Church Fathers in Latin, astonished by the amount of later inventions they treated as revelation. And at some point, during one of those silent readings, by the light of a solitary candle, he realized something. He realized that there were 2 Jesuses painted on the same canvas. Below, almost erased by the layers of more recent paint, there was a man, a Jew, a carpenter, a rabbi without a diploma, a guy with sunburned skin, disheveled hair, and sandals covered in dust. This man spoke Aramaic, a peasant language that the temple doctors despised. This man had family. He had a mother. He had brothers who doubted him. He had fishermen friends who slept during his most anguished prayers. This man cried. He was afraid. He got emotional. He got angry. He fled when the crowd wanted to make him king. He said things like, "Whoever has 2 tunics should give one to the one who has none." Or, "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven." This man never founded a religion. He never built a temple. He never ordered that statues be carved in his name. And he died on a Friday afternoon, nailed to 2 wooden beams, abandoned by almost all his followers, shouting in Aramaic a phrase that means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" On top of that face, layer after layer, century after century, another figure had been painted. A majestic figure, a luminous figure, a figure with the solemn beard of Zeus, with the imperial gaze of Apollo, with the scepter of Roman emperors, with the golden crown of Egyptian pharaohs. This figure did not walk barefoot on the roads. It was carried in processions on golden litters. This figure did not share bread with fishermen. It was distributed in consecrated hosts by priests dressed in silk. This figure did not die screaming to a silent sky. It reigned, seated on a cosmic throne, judging the living and the dead, deciding the eternal fate of souls. This figure, mark my words, magnificently served the interests of empires. It served the Habsburgs, the Bourbons, the Romanovs, the popes, the inquisitors, the crusading kings, the merchants of indulgences, the builders of cathedrals. And Spinoza, looking at these 2 faces that tradition had fused into one, did what no Jew, no Christian, no priest, no rabbi had had the courage to do so systematically before him. He asked, what if these 2 faces are in fact 2 different men? What if the second face was constructed, brushstroke by brushstroke, over 1600 years, by hands that had much more interest in thrones than in truth? This question came at a high cost. It cost more than you can imagine. On July 27, 1656, the Jewish community of Amsterdam gathered in a solemn ritual. They lit black candles in the center of the synagogue. They sounded the shofar, that ram's horn whose sound resembles an ancient wail from the depths of the earth. And they read, over the young Baruch, the harshest curse that all of Judaism knew. It is called Cherem. They said word for word that he would be cursed morning and night, cursed when he rose and when he lay down, cursed when he entered anywhere and when he left. No Jew, anywhere in the world, could speak to him, write to him, approach him within 4 cubits. No Jew could read his texts. No Jew could help him in case of illness or hunger. His own father, who was already dead, was symbolically summoned from the other world to repudiate that son. They tried to erase him. They struck his name from the book of the living, and even that was not enough. A few weeks later, upon leaving a public building, a fanatic lunged at him with a dagger gleaming in the twilight. The blade cut through the air, tore the fabric of his coat, missed his chest by a hair's breadth. Spinoza collected that coat and took it home. He hung it on the wall of his room, and there, that coat with an open cut like a mute mouth remained for the rest of his life, not as a trophy, as a reminder, a daily reminder, upon waking and going to bed, that true words have a price, and that this price is almost always paid in blood. He lived the next 20 years in small Dutch towns. He exchanged the name Baruch for the Latin Benedict, as the former was cursed. He learned to polish glass lenses for microscopes and telescopes. Notice the beauty of this choice. While his hands polished small pieces of glass that allowed scientists to see what was previously invisible, his mind polished ideas that would allow humanity to see what institutional religion, for 1600 years, had hidden under layers of gold and Latin. He refused chairs offered at famous universities. He refused pensions from kings. He refused everything, for he knew that the moment he accepted a salary from any institution, he would lose the right to tell the whole truth. And in 1670, he anonymously published the most explosive book of his time, the theological political treatise, a book that was printed with a false publisher, false city, false author, all to escape the inquisitors. And even so, it was discovered, and even so, it was banned. And here's an extraordinary detail, a detail that perhaps summarizes better than anything else the magnitude of what Spinoza did. That book was the only book in modern history capable of being condemned at the same time by the Roman Catholic Church, by the Dutch Reformed Church, by Sephardic rabbis, by German Lutherans, by Swiss Calvinists, and by British Anglicans. He achieved the miraculous feat of uniting all the religions of the West in a single shared sentiment: absolute dread. Why? Because in that book, Spinoza did something very simple and very terrible. He read the Bible as one reads any other ancient book, without blind reverence, without accepting beforehand that every comma had been dictated by God. He asked, who wrote this? When? In what language? For whom? With what political purpose? And the discoveries came down like a hammer on glass. He discovered that Moses could not have written the 5 books attributed to him, because those books describe his own death and burial. He discovered that the prophets contradict each other with an embarrassing frequency. He discovered that the 4 Gospels were written decades after Jesus' death, in Greek, by anonymous authors who probably never knew him personally, and that they diverge on absolutely fundamental points of the narrative. He discovered that the miracles narrated follow literary patterns that circulated in the ancient world long before Christ, in Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, and Greek legends. And from these discoveries he wrote the phrase that, 400 years later, still burns like a brand on the skin of theologians. He wrote that theology is not the daughter of revelation, but the daughter of politics. In other words, what is taught in catechism, what is preached from the heights of pulpits, what is carved in dogmas and marble statues, none of this was whispered by God into the ears of holy men on nights of solitary prayer. All of this was decided in meetings, meetings of men, men with armies, men with coffers, men with thrones to defend. In the next blocks, we will walk together, slowly, through this labyrinth of broken mirrors. We will get to know the Jesus that emerges from the Dead Sea Scrolls, those parchments buried in desert caves, hidden there for some reason that no one has yet fully understood. We will read together the Gospels that Constantine ordered to be burned, those texts that did not enter the canon because they contradicted imperial interests. We will peek through the crack of the door of the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, at the exact moment when bishops gathered by order of a pagan emperor literally voted on who Jesus was and who he was not. We will meet the first Christians of Palestine, before Paul of Tarsus, a man who never saw Jesus in life, rewrote everything for a Greek audience. And we will, above all, listen to the silent voice of the carpenter from Galilee trying to cut through the noise of cathedral bells, reach us, whisper what he really meant before it was erased. I want to make one last thing clear before we continue. This is not a video against faith. Spinoza was never against faith. He believed in God with a depth, with an intensity, with a radicality that left all the professional theologians of his time embarrassed. He was against lies, against the use of the sacred as a tool of domination, against superstition sold at retail, against human power disguised as divine will. If you have faith, stay with me until the end, and perhaps your faith will emerge from this journey stronger than it has ever been. If you do not have faith, stay with me until the end, and perhaps you will find here something you did not expect to find, something sacred in a place you have never looked before. So close the door, turn off the excessive lights, pour yourself a warm drink, get comfortable, and prepare to, for the next few hours, become once again what every human being once was before being tamed by institutions, a free consciousness, with wide-open eyes, facing one of the greatest questions humanity has ever posed about itself. The story begins now. Before we enter the great cathedrals, before we hear the bronze bells of the imperial cities, before we walk through the golden mosaics of Ravenna, we need to do something much more difficult. We need to travel back in time. Not to 4th century Rome, where Christianity became the official religion, not to 2nd century Antioch, where Paul of Tarsus reformulated the Galilean message for Greek audiences. We need to travel further back than that. We need to reach a poor village with sun-bleached stone houses, planted on an insignificant hill on the map of the Roman Empire. A village that no one mentioned in any book of antiquity, until, at a very specific moment, one of its sons refused to stay quiet. The village was called Nazareth. Imagine the place. Not the touristy Nazareth of today, full of basilicas and souvenirs. Imagine first-century Nazareth. About 400 people at most. Lean goats grazing among the stones. Cisterns carved into the rock to store rainwater. Houses pressed against each other, sharing walls, with courtyards where wheat was ground by hand, bread was baked in clay ovens, canned sheep wool was spun while stories were told at night around small oil lamps. A village so insignificant that the very Gospel of John records a rhetorical question that sums it all up. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? That was the reputation of the place. A hole, a shadow on the map, a corner of the world where nothing important had ever happened. It was right there that the man who would shake the foundations of the Western world was born. Only he did not know it. No one knew. The neighbors simply called him Yeshua, which is the original Aramaic form of the name that the West would later translate as Jesus. Yeshua bar Yosef, that is, Jesus, son of Joseph, as one would say today. And if you had passed through the village at any time during his first 30 years of life, you might not have even noticed him. A common man, thin like almost all peasants of the time, dark hair, disheveled beard, sunburned skin from the Palestinian sun, worn sandals, calloused hands from working with wood, as that was the family profession, although the Greek word used in the Gospels, tekton, can mean both carpenter and mason, or more generally, a manual worker specialized in construction. This is the first shock that modern historical research offers us. The historical Jesus was not the blond boy with blue eyes from Renaissance paintings. He was not the young man in immaculate white robes walking on flowers in catechism illustrations. He was a Semitic Jew, dark-skinned, probably short, as the average height of men in Judea at that time, according to bones analyzed by forensic anthropologists, was around 1.65 meters, probably with rough skin, yellowed teeth, oily hair from lack of bathing, clothes smelling of accumulated sweat from many days of walking. A man who sweated, a man who smelled, a man who had fleas in his clothes, like all the poor of his time. A real man, in other words, not a painted icon. And this man spoke Aramaic. This is a fundamental piece of information because almost no one pays attention to it. Aramaic was the language of peasants, fishermen, and shepherds in the Galilee region. It was a language despised by the intellectuals of Jerusalem who preferred the classical Hebrew of the priests or the sophisticated Greek of the literate. When Jesus preached in the synagogues of the small towns around the Sea of Tiberias, he was speaking in a language that the temple doctors considered vulgar. When he healed a sick person, the phrase that came from his lips was something like Talitha Kum, an Aramaic expression preserved in the Gospel of Mark that means, "Girl, get up." When he shouted on the cross, according to the same Gospel, the words were Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, a mixed Aramaic and Hebrew form of Psalm 22. And here arises an absolutely decisive technical question, which Spinoza was one of the first to articulate with mathematical precision. The Gospels were not written in Aramaic. The Gospels were written in Greek, in Koine Greek to be exact, which was the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean at that time, but a language that Jesus almost certainly never used to preach. What does this mean in practice? It means that between the real voice of the rabbi from Galilee and the text we now read in the Bible, there are at least two layers of translation. The first layer, from the original words in Aramaic to the oral memory of the disciples who heard them. The second layer, from that oral memory to the written form in Greek done decades later, by authors who largely were not even in Palestine. And you know as well as I do that, in any translation, there are things that are lost, things that are added, things that are transformed. Imagine in two successive translations, made orally, in different cultural contexts, with decades of distance. The historical Jesus, therefore, is someone we need to reconstruct in pieces, like a vase broken on the floor of a museum, whose fragments are scattered across various rooms. Some pieces are in the canonical Gospels, in the passages that researchers call ipsissima verba, a Latin expression that means the very words, those passages in which textual criticism agrees that there is a higher probability that we have come close to what Jesus actually said. Other pieces are in the apocryphal Gospels, in texts like the Gospel of Thomas, found in 1945 in the desert of Egypt, which preserves a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, some of which are very similar to those in the canonical Gospels, others completely different and surprising. Other pieces are in the references of non-Christian authors of the time, such as the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who mentions Jesus in 2 passages of his Jewish antiquities, or the Roman Tacitus, who in his annals records the execution of Christ under Pontius Pilate. And when we put these pieces together, when we patiently reassemble the vase, the face that emerges is fascinating. Jesus was, above all else, an apocalyptic Jew. Almost all great scholars agree on this, from Albert Schweitzer in the early 20th century to Bart Ehrman and Dale Allison in our days. What does it mean to say that he was an apocalyptic Jew? It means that he belonged to a very specific religious tradition within the Judaism of his time, a tradition that believed that the world was about to end, not in 1,000 years, not in some indeterminate future. Now, in that very generation, Jesus believed and preached to his followers that the kingdom of God was about to break forth upon the earth, that God would intervene directly in history, destroy the unjust powers that oppressed Israel, and establish a new order in which the poor would be first, the humble would be exalted, and the rich would be sent away empty-handed. This apocalyptic conviction explains almost everything Jesus said and did, in a way that traditional theology has always tried to soften. When Jesus says, in Mark chapter 9, that some of those who are here will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God coming with power, he was not speaking metaphorically of a spiritual experience. He was making a concrete prophecy about events he expected to happen within a few years, at most decades. When he sends the disciples on a mission in Matthew chapter 10 and says, "You will not finish going through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes," he is literally saying that. The proximity was real for him, imminent, so close that it wasn't worth worrying about tomorrow, it wasn't worth storing treasures on earth, it wasn't worth accumulating wealth or building lasting institutions. The end was there at the door. And this is the first great dissonance between the historical Jesus and the institutional Christ. Because when the end did not come, when the years passed, when the disciples began to die without the promised kingdom having manifested, Jesus' successors had a monumental problem on their hands. What to do with a religion founded on the expectation of an imminent end when that end is delayed? The historical answer was reinterpretation. What Jesus had said about the kingdom coming in flesh and blood was gradually translated into a spiritual, inner celestial kingdom that would be experienced after death and not during life. What he had said about a concrete divine intervention in history was transformed into a deferred eschatology, projected into an increasingly distant future. And what had been a marginal movement within Judaism, led by a wandering prophet who promised the imminent liberation of the oppressed, was transformed over centuries into a Roman, imperial, universal institution that guaranteed its members not earthly liberation, but heavenly salvation. And here is the point that Spinoza identified with surgical precision 300 years before archaeology confirmed everything with manuscripts buried in the desert. He realized that this transformation was not accidental. It was not merely the natural result of the passage of time. It was a political operation, a consciously constructed operation by men who had very concrete interests in transforming a peasant rabbi into a cosmic lord. Because a peasant rabbi preaching the end of the world is dangerous for empires, a cosmic lord reigning over the heavens, while the emperor reigns over the earth, is convenient for empires. A prophet who commands the distribution of goods to the poor disturbs the rich. A Christ who promises paradise in the afterlife while enduring the injustices of this world reassures the rich. Jesus was systematically transformed into what power needed him to be. When a man dies, his image begins to transform immediately. This is true for anyone. For a grandfather who passes away, he becomes, in a few months, the memory of the grandchildren in something greater than he was. The flaws fade away, the virtues are amplified, the stories are told and retold, each time with a little more grandeur. This is human memory at work. For a king who dies, this process accelerates violently. For a prophet, even more so. And for a prophet who died young, in the fullness of his intensity, nailed to a wooden cross, abandoned by most of his followers, shouting to a silent sky, the process becomes an avalanche that does not stop, an avalanche that goes decade after decade, century after century, depositing successive layers of snow over the original face of the dead, until the original face disappears completely, buried under the White Mountain. This is what happened to Jesus. In the first years after his death, around the year 30 or 33 of our era, his followers were a small, frightened, confused group, discreetly gathered in the houses of Jerusalem. They were practicing Jews. They continued to attend the temple. They continued to observe the commandments of the Torah. They continued to keep the Sabbath. They had no idea they were founding a new religion. They simply believed that the rabbi who had been crucified was the promised Messiah, that God had resurrected him as a sign, and that he would soon return in the clouds of heaven to establish the kingdom. Their waiting was not abstract. It was of days, weeks, months. The entire first generation of Christians lived and died, thinking they would see the return of Jesus in flesh and blood with their own eyes. They were led by James, the brother of Jesus. Notice this, viewer, the brother. Because in the canonical Gospels, especially those written later, there is a whole effort to erase this figure. The Catholic Church would later develop the doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity, which would imply that Jesus could not have had biological brothers. But the oldest texts, including the authentic letters of Paul, mention James without any shame, literally calling him the brother of the Lord. James was the leader of the Jerusalem community, an observant Jew, a man who, according to the historian Flavius Josephus, was so known for his piety that when he was stoned by the high priests in 62 AD, there were popular protests in Jerusalem. James and the other brothers of Jesus led that first community for decades, and their view of who Jesus had been was probably the closest to the historical reality. A rabbi, a prophet, a Jewish teacher, perhaps the promised Messiah, but a man. And then Paul happened. This name changes everything. Paul of Tarsus, a Hellenized Jew born in a Greek city in present-day Turkey, a Roman citizen by birth, trained in the strictest Pharisaic tradition, a brilliant, cultured, trilingual man who never knew Jesus in the flesh. Notice this well, Paul never saw Jesus, he never heard him preach, he never participated in the Last Supper, he was never at the foot of the cross. Everything Paul knew about Jesus, as he himself admits in his letters, came from a mystical vision he had on the road to Damascus, around the year 34 or 35, about 1 or 2 years after the crucifixion. And Paul begins to preach. Only he preaches in a completely different way than the apostles who had lived with Jesus. While James and Peter insisted that Jesus' followers should continue to be Jews, should continue to circumcise their children, should continue to follow the dietary laws, Paul proclaims a radically new message. A message directed to the Gentiles, that is, to non-Jews, to Greeks, to Romans, to the pagan peoples of the Mediterranean. And in this message, circumcision is no longer necessary. The dietary laws are abolished. The observance of the Sabbath is relativized. What matters, according to Paul, is faith in Christ. And in this preaching, Jesus is slowly but systematically transformed. He ceases to be an apocalyptic Jewish rabbi and begins to become something else, something closer to a Hellenistic savior god, something akin to the mystical deities that already existed in the Greek world, like Mithras, Dionysus, Osiris. Here is a pause, viewer, for me to speak directly to you. Stop for a moment. Let me tell you something from the bottom of my heart. If you have made it this far, if these words are touching somewhere inside you that you didn't even know existed, I want to ask you a favor. Not a favor for this channel, a favor for yourself. Don't keep this restlessness to yourself. Write in the comments right now, even before finishing the video, one single thing. Write like this. What was the phrase that moved you the most up to this moment? It can be a specific phrase I said. It can be an image that passed through your mind. It can be a name, a detail, an idea. Write that phrase in the comments, because each person who reads this type of reflection sees something different, and when you write what you saw, You help others see things they might not see alone. The comments on this video will hopefully become a kind of collective confessional, a library of small human discoveries. A beautiful thing if you participate. And I take this opportunity to ask you for another thing. If what you are hearing here is worthwhile, if you feel that this is the adult, serious conversation without fear that has been lacking in the world, subscribe to the channel right now, because here we do not treat the viewer like a child. Here we talk as Spinoza would talk to you if he were alive. With respect for your intelligence, without beating around the bush, without infantilization, without fear of saying what no one says. Click on the bell, activate notifications, and come be part of this circle of seekers. Seekers are few, they always have been, but when they meet, something important happens. Let's return to Paul. So, as I was saying, Paul begins this transformation, but the transformation does not end with him. It continues, and it accelerates dramatically with the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in 70 AD. This is an event that few people understand in its full gravity. In the year 70, after a Jewish revolt against Roman rule, the imperial legions besieged Jerusalem, entered the city, and destroyed the temple that Herod had built, that magnificent temple that had been the religious heart of the Jewish people for centuries. The temple was set on fire. The walls were torn down, stone upon stone, exactly as Jesus had prophesied would happen. Thousands of Jews were killed or enslaved, and the Christian community of Jerusalem, that community led by Jesus' relatives, was dispersed. Some fled to the city of Pella across the Jordan. Others disappeared from the records of history. What happened from there? The leadership of the Christian movement left the hands of Palestinian Jews and fell into the hands of Gentile Christians, of the Greeks converted by Paul, of sympathetic Romans, of Hellenistic intellectuals from Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus. And these new leaders did not know the original context of Jesus. They did not speak Aramaic. They had not lived with the fishermen of Galilee. They did not know what the taste of unleavened bread eaten in Nazareth on Saturday mornings was. All they had was the text in Greek. And from the text in Greek, they began to reinterpret, to rewrite, to construct a figure of Christ that would be palatable to their pagan listeners. The canonical Gospels were written during this period. Mark around 70 AD, Matthew and Luke around 80 to 90, John at the end of the 1st century, perhaps the beginning of the 2nd. Each of them reflects the concerns and interpretations of the community in which it was written. Mark presents a more human, more anguished Jesus, closer to the original memories. Matthew reconstructs Jesus as the new Moses, emphasizing the Jewish aspects of his preaching. Luke writes for a Gentile audience, softening the more radical demands of the original message. And John, written several decades later, presents a Jesus completely different from the first three. A Jesus who makes long philosophical speeches. A Jesus who speaks of himself as the way, the truth, and the life. A Jesus who identifies with the pre-existing Word of God in a language deeply influenced by Greek philosophy, especially Platonism and the thought of Philo of Alexandria. And it is there in the Gospel of John that the cosmic figure of Christ is consolidated. That Christ who existed before all things. That Christ through whom all things were made. That Christ who was God from the beginning. This image does not appear in the synoptic Gospels, that is, in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, at least not explicitly. It is a later theological construction, made by a community that had had 70 years to reflect, speculate, and philosophize about who Jesus might have been. Spinoza, reading these texts with his mathematical attention, perceived this difference with a clarity that astonished the theologians of his time. He wrote that the Gospels, when compared to one another, do not agree on practically any of the fundamental details. They do not agree on the genealogy of Jesus. They do not agree on the circumstances of his birth. They do not agree on the chronology of his public life. They do not agree on the location where he appeared resurrected. They do not agree on what he said on the cross, and they do not agree especially on his own nature. In Mark, Jesus seems surprised when called good, and responds, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God." In John, Jesus calmly says, "I and the Father are one." These are two different theologies, two different portraits, two memories, constructed in different contexts, for different audiences with different objectives. And that was just the beginning, because after the Gospels the councils would come, and with the councils the political operation would assume dimensions that neither Paul, nor John, nor James could ever have imagined. To understand what happened in the year 325 of our era, in a city called Nicaea, on the shores of a lake in present-day Turkey, you first need to understand who was sitting on the throne of Rome, because that was not a religious council led by pious bishops in search of spiritual truth. That was a political assembly convened, financed, presided over, and determined by an emperor. An emperor, by the way, who was not yet a Christian. Constantine the Great would only be baptized on his deathbed, 13 years after Nicaea. Throughout his active life, he maintained the title of Pontifex Maximus, high priest of the Roman pagan religion, and the coins minted during his reign continued to display the god Sol Invictus. This is the man who decided who Jesus was, a Roman pagan, an emperor who had just murdered his own son Crispus and his own wife Fausta in palace intrigues in the same year he presided over the council. Think about that for a moment, viewer. The man who, in practice, decided the divine nature of Christ for the next 17 centuries of Western Christianity was a man who worshipped the Son as the main deity, who ordered the killing of relatives when politics demanded it, and who saw in the new Christian religion, above all, a useful instrument for unifying a fragmented empire. Constantine was not interested in theological nuances. He himself said, in preserved letters, that the disputes among bishops about whether Jesus was of the same substance or of a similar substance to the Father were trivial, irrelevant questions unworthy of imperial attention. But he perceived, with the political instinct of a Roman statesman, that if these disputes continued to divide Christians, the empire itself would be at risk. Because in the previous years, a discussion had split the Christian communities of the Mediterranean. The discussion had been provoked by a presbyter from Alexandria named Arius. Arius was a tall, thin, ascetic man, deeply knowledgeable of the scriptures, and he asked an apparently innocent question. If Jesus is the Son of God, Arius asked, then there was a moment when God the Father existed and the Son did not yet exist. After all, a son is always posterior to the Father. Therefore, Arius concluded, Jesus cannot be eternal in the same way as the Father. He is a sublime creature, the first creature, the divine instrument through which all other things were created, but he is still a creature. He is not God in the full sense. He is not identical to the Father in substance. This thesis of Arius caught fire. It spread through the cities of the East like wildfire. Some bishops embraced it enthusiastically, others denounced it as heresy. In the streets of Alexandria, in public baths, in markets, in bakeries, ordinary people debated whether Jesus was homoousios to the Father, that is, consubstantial, of the same substance, or whether he was homoousios, of a similar but not identical substance. A single letter, the Greek letter iota, separated the two words, and because of that single letter, bishops were deposed, communities were divided, families were torn apart, cities were thrown into turmoil. It was to resolve this impasse, not for spiritual reasons but for political reasons of imperial stability, that Constantine convened the council in Nicaea in the summer of 325. About 300 bishops answered the call. They came from all over the Mediterranean world. They came from Syria, Palestine, Asia Minor, Egypt, Greece, Italy, and even a few from the more distant western provinces. Many of them were men who'd been tortured in recent persecutions during the reign of Emperor Diocletian. They arrived in Nicaea with pierced eyes, with amputated limbs, with scars on their backs. And now, suddenly, these men who until recently had been persecuted as criminals found themselves summoned to the imperial table, hosted in palaces, served at banquets funded by the public treasury. Constantine received them with honors. He kissed their hands. He treated them like princes. And then he invited them with the courteous smile of someone giving a disguised order to reach an agreement. The agreement was the Nicene Creed. The text was drafted, debated, amended over several weeks, And in the end it was established that Jesus is homoousios to the Father, that is, of the same substance, of the same essence, equally eternal, equally God. Arius's thesis was condemned as heresy. The bishops who refused to sign the creed, only 2, were exiled by imperial order. Arius's books were burned, and anyone caught with a copy of them at home would receive the death penalty. Arius himself was exiled to Illyria. Notice, viewer, what happened there. A theological doctrine was defined by majority vote in a political assembly under the direct pressure of a pagan emperor, and the dissenters were silenced by imperial decree with the death penalty for the stubborn. Exactly this is what Spinoza pointed out as the moment when theology became the daughter of politics. Because the question of whether Jesus is or is not of the same substance as the Father is a question that, by its very nature, cannot be decided by voting. If it is true regardless of votes. If it is a lie regardless of votes. The truth does not submit to the democracy of bishops. The truth, even less so, submits to the geopolitical interests of an emperor in search of administrative unity. And yet, it was precisely how the figure of Christ began to be defined for the West. Everything that came after, all subsequent dogmas, all heresies condemned in subsequent councils, in Constantinople in 381, in Ephesus in 431, in Chalcedon in 451, all this enormous theological edifice was built on the foundation of that political decision of 325. A foundation that could very well have been different. If the votes had been different, if Constantine had supported Arius instead of Athanasius, Western Christianity would have 2,000 years of completely different history. Jesus would not be worshipped as God incarnate. He would be venerated as the greatest creature in the universe, the sublime mediator between the Father and humanity, but not as identical in substance to the Father. And what is perhaps more interesting, this alternative survived in certain branches of Christianity for many centuries after Nicaea. The Goths, the Vandals, the Lombards, the Germanic peoples who invaded the Roman Empire in the 5th and 6th centuries were converted to Christianity by Arian missionaries. For hundreds of years, vast regions of Europe and North Africa were Christian, but not Nicene. Their Jesus was the Jesus of Arius, not the Jesus of Nicaea. Only with the conquests of the Franks under Clovis at the end of the 5th century, and then with the Byzantine reconquest in the 6th century, was Arianism definitively extirpated from Europe, not by the force of theological argument, but by the force of arms. All of this, viewer, is documented history. I am not making anything up. You can read this information in the most conservative church history manuals, often written by Catholic or Protestant authors. The facts are not in dispute. What is in dispute is the meaning of these facts. And it is precisely about the meaning that Spinoza concentrated his intelligence. He asked, if the figure of Christ, as defined in the Church's dogmas, was the result of imperial political decisions made by voting in assemblies convened by emperors, then to what extent does this figure correspond to the historical man of Galilee? To what extent is this figure a construction elaborated by centuries of politics? Spinoza's answer, if we read between the lines of the theological political treatise with the caution he was forced to use to avoid immediate execution, is terrifying. This figure, he implicitly says, is construction, not discovery. It is elaboration, not revelation. It is the fruit of the encounter between the original message of the Jewish rabbi and the interests of the Roman state. It has therefore little to do with what Jesus really was, little to do with what he preached, little to do with the God he knew in his solitary prayers on the Mount of Olives. And here is the most delicate point of this entire argument. Spinoza does not deny that Jesus was an extraordinary man. He does not deny that the original message has real spiritual depth. On the contrary, Spinoza admired Jesus. He referred to him, in private letters, in terms of the highest respect, calling him a man who understood the essence of the divine like few others. What Spinoza denies is that the imperial Christ of the Nicene Church is, in fact, the same Jesus. He sees in this imperial Christ a mask placed over the face of the rabbi, a heavy ornate golden mask, but which, because it is a mask, hides as much as it reveals, and perhaps hides much more than it reveals. In the next steps of this investigation, we will open this mask. We will see from the inside how it was shaped. We will carefully follow how each ornament was added, in which century, for what reasons, under which emperor, in which council. Because history, when told honestly, is the best antidote against the mythologies that human powers build to legitimize themselves. In December 1945 in Egypt, a peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Samman was digging on a limestone slope near the small town of Nag Hammadi, searching for a type of soil that would serve as fertilizer for his fields. His spade struck something hard and hollow, a ceramic jar, approximately the size of an oil jug, sealed with red wax. Muhammad hesitated for a moment before breaking the jar. In that region, local legends told stories of buried jars that held jinns, malevolent spirits that took revenge on those who freed them. But curiosity won over fear. He raised the spade and shattered the ceramic. From inside the jar, no jinn sprang forth. Something much more dangerous emerged for certain robed men in Rome, in the Vatican City. A library emerged, 13 leather-bound codices, more than 50 religious texts written in Coptic, the language of ancient Christian Egypt. Texts that had been buried by monks in the 4th century, probably between 367 and 400 of our era, to hide them from the imperial inquisitors, who at that moment were beginning to systematically persecute any form of Christianity that did not conform to the Nicene canon. These texts, collectively known today as the Nag Hammadi Library, contained Gospels. Gospels that no one had read for more than 1,500 years. Gospels that had been declared heretical, forbidden, persecuted, burned in public by order of Constantine and his successors. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of the Egyptians, various apocalypses attributed to Peter, Paul, James, Adam. Texts that preserved, in many cases, ancient traditions about Jesus, dated by some experts to the end of the 1st century, that is, contemporary with the canonical Gospels. When these texts were finally translated and published, starting in the 1970s, the academic world was shocked, because those Gospels told a different story. They showed a different Jesus. They revealed that, in the early centuries of Christianity, there was an impressive plurality of interpretations about who Jesus had been, what he had taught, what the meaning of his life had been. This plurality was methodically crushed by the ecclesiastical authorities that triumphed after Nicaea. But it existed, and the texts of Nag Hammadi are the surviving proof. Take, for example, the Gospel of Thomas. This text is a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. It is not a narrative like the canonical Gospels. There is no account of birth, ministry, passion, death, resurrection. There are only sentences, proverbs, parables, short dialogues. Many of these sentences are practically identical to those found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which leads many experts to believe that Thomas preserves, in its oldest layer, material that dates back to the historical Jesus with as much authenticity as the canonical Gospels, or even more. Other sayings of Thomas, however, are completely different, and it is in these differences that things get interesting. Consider saying number 3 of Thomas. Jesus says, "The kingdom is within you and outside you. When you know yourselves, you will be known, and you will know that you are the children of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, then you will dwell in poverty, and you yourselves are that poverty." Notice, the kingdom is not in heaven, to which we will go after we die. It is not in the future, when Jesus returns in clouds of glory. The kingdom is within us, and knowing the kingdom is knowing oneself. This is an inner, contemplative, Gnostic spirituality that has been systematically removed from official Christianity, but that echoes, curiously, certain mystical currents of Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism. Or consider the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, a precious fragment found in a different manuscript in 1896 in the city of Cairo. In this text, Mary Magdalene appears as Jesus' closest disciple, the one who received secret teachings from him, the one to whom the Master confided visions that were not shared with the male apostles. After Jesus' death, Mary gathers the disciples, and Peter asks her to share what she received in private. She begins to speak, and there is a discussion. Andrew questions Mary's words. Peter rejects the idea that Jesus revealed things to a woman that he did not reveal to men. Levi intervenes in defense of Mary, telling Peter that he has always been tempestuous, and that if the Savior chose Mary as worthy, who is Peter to reject the Savior's choice? This text raises an uncomfortable question. What if original Christianity had recognized Mary Magdalene as an apostle, perhaps even as the chief apostle, and this tradition had been systematically erased by the patriarchal church that consolidated afterward? There are indications of this in the canonical texts themselves. In all four Gospels, without exception, Mary Magdalene is the first person to see the risen Christ. In all of them, she is sent to announce the resurrection to the apostles. It was customary in ancient cultures to call the first witness of an event an apostle, that is, one who is sent. Mary Magdalene, therefore, by the very criteria of the canonical Gospels, would be the apostle of the apostles. And this was, by the way, a designation that was attributed to her by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. But popular memory, guided by centuries of ecclesiastical reinterpretation, transformed this primordial apostle into something very different, into a repentant prostitute, although no text in the New Testament describes her that way. This identification of Mary Magdalene with a prostitute began with a homily by Pope Gregory the Great in 591 AD, who arbitrarily combined three different women from the Gospels into a single figure. This deliberate confusion, this posthumous defamation, lasted more than 1,300 years, until the Vatican in 1969 discreetly corrected the misunderstanding, without fanfare, without acknowledging the damage caused. This is just a small example of how the memory of original Christianity was literally rewritten by the triumphant institution. And Spinoza, even without access to the texts of Nag Hammadi, which would be found 3 centuries after his death, perceived the mechanism. He realized just by reading the canonical texts with analytical attention that there were layers upon layers, contradictions upon contradictions, additions upon additions. He noticed that the canonical Gospels, as preserved, already bore evident marks of editing, intervention, rewriting. When he read the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew and then the genealogy in Luke, and saw that they were incompatible, he did not need a microscope to understand what was happening. There were 2 different Christian communities, with 2 different genealogical traditions, each claiming legitimacy to define the Davidic ancestry of the Messiah. Let's go to another impressive example, the narrative of the resurrection. In the 4 canonical Gospels, the story is told in ways that do not agree with each other. In Mark, the oldest form of the text, what we call the short ending, ends abruptly at verse 8 of chapter 16. The women go to the tomb, find it empty. A young man dressed in white tells them that Jesus has risen, and they flee, seized with trembling and astonishment, and said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Period. Thus ends the oldest Gospel, without appearances of the risen one, without ascension to heaven, without a universal mission given to the apostles. Just the empty tomb and the fear of the women. The verses from 9 to 20 that appear in common Bibles today were added in the 2nd century by later scribes who found the original ending unsatisfactory. They are absent from the oldest and most reliable manuscripts, such as the Sinaitic Codex and the Vatican Codex, and all serious scholars recognize that they are a late interpolation. So imagine what this means. The oldest Gospel of all, which serves as the basis for the other synoptics, originally ends without any appearance of the risen Jesus. All the later narratives, those of Matthew, Luke, and John, which tell of Jesus appearing to the apostles, eating fish with them, showing his wounds to Thomas walking on the road to Emmaus, were developed decades later, with substantial variations among them. And if we read Paul, who wrote even before the first Gospel, we will see that he describes the resurrection not as a bodily resurrection in the material sense, but as a spiritual transformation, a visionary appearance, something he explicitly compares to his own experience on the road to Damascus. For Paul, seeing the risen Christ was having a vision. It was not encountering a flesh-and-blood man eating grilled fish. The bodily narratives of the later Gospels are later developments, not the original tradition. These are discoveries that, for a traditional religious reader, are shocking. But for an honest scholar of ancient texts, they are well-established facts. And Spinoza was one of the first to articulate all this publicly, in an accessible book in a language that any educated person of his time could understand. That is why the religious powers of all confessions wanted to silence him, because he was taking the ground from under their feet. He was showing that the dogmatic Christ of the Church is not the faithful result of an uninterrupted tradition from Jesus. It is the result of a long historical process of selection, editing, interpretation, and imposition. A process perfectly human, with all the qualities and all the vices of the human. A process that had many beautiful, true, holy moments, and many dark, manipulative, political moments. Recognizing this is not to destroy faith, it is to free it from the shackles with which human history has bound it. There is a type of courage that most people never need to exercise. The courage to take what you have been taught to revere since childhood, what your parents and grandparents revered before you, what is treated as the most sacred object of your culture, and look at that object with new eyes, cold eyes, analytical eyes that ask without fear, what is this really? This courage, viewer, is perhaps the most difficult of all human courage, because it ultimately means being willing to lose what gave you comfort in the difficult nights of childhood, to lose what connected you to your beloved dead, to lose what gave you identity in a confusing world. This courage costs, and that is why most people throughout their lives never exercise it. Spinoza exercised it, and in exercising it, he invented what we now call modern biblical criticism, a discipline that did not exist before him, a discipline that has become, in the last 350 years, one of the most fertile and unsettling fields of Western scholarship, a discipline that continues to this day, producing discoveries that, if widely known by the general public, would profoundly reformat the way people understand sacred texts. Spinoza's method was astonishingly simple, and it is this simplicity, precisely, that makes it so powerful. He proposed that the Bible be read like any other ancient book, period. Without assuming that every word is divinely inspired, without assuming that Moses wrote the Pentateuch just because tradition says he wrote it, without assuming that the 4 canonical Gospels are literal historical accounts just because the Church declared them so. Instead of starting from reverence, start from investigation. Instead of starting from belief, start from question. Instead of reading the text through the lens of dogma, read the text through the text itself, with everything it says and everything it contradicts. Spinoza formulated this in a phrase that became famous. He said that the knowledge of Scripture must be sought only from Scripture itself. That is, one should not use later dogmas to interpret earlier texts. One should not read the Old Testament through the eyes of the New Testament, nor the New Testament through the eyes of the councils. Each text must be understood from its own historical, cultural, linguistic context. Who wrote it? In what language? In what time? For what audience? With what intentions? In response to what concrete events? Only with these answers, Spinoza said, can we begin to understand what the text is really saying, as opposed to what tradition, for its own reasons, claimed it said. And when Spinoza applied this method to biblical texts, the results were devastating. Take, as a first example, the question of the authorship of the Pentateuch. Jewish tradition, for time immemorial, claimed that the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, had been written by Moses himself. This attribution was considered an absolute dogma, both in Judaism and Christianity. Contesting it was heresy. And Spinoza, reading the texts themselves with attention, noticed the obvious. He realized that Deuteronomy, chapter 34, narrates the death and burial of Moses. It even states that no one knows his burial place to this day. Now, how could Moses have written about his own death? How could a man describe his own burial and say that the tomb remained unknown until today? The phrase, until today, by itself, already implies that the author is writing at a time much later than the narrated event. Later generations, perhaps centuries later. Spinoza realized much more than that. He noticed that the Pentateuch contains internal contradictions, disconcerting repetitions, variations in style, different names for God in different passages, incompatible laws. In Genesis, for example, there are two completely different creation narratives in chapters 1 and 2, with different orders of events, with different emphases, with different languages. There are two intertwined versions of the flood, in which, in one version, Noah takes a pair of each animal species to the ark, and in the other, takes 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean ones. Spinoza realized that the text, as we have it, is clearly the product of diverse hands, different sources, stitched together at later times by editors, who sometimes did not bother to harmonize the contradictions presented by their sources. This observation, made in 1670, was the starting point for what would become 2 centuries later the documentary hypothesis of biblical criticism, developed by German scholars such as Karl Heinrich Graf and Julius Wellhausen. According to this hypothesis, the Pentateuch would be the product of the combination of 4 main sources: the Yahwist source, the Elohist source, the priestly source, and the Deuteronomist source. Each of these sources would have been composed at different times in different contexts by anonymous authors. And the final text we have today would be the result of the intertwining of these sources by a priestly editor of the post-exilic period, probably in the 5th century BC, almost 1,000 years after the supposed events narrated in Exodus. Think about it, viewer. Think about the enormity of what this means. If the narratives of Exodus, the crossing of the Red Sea, the giving of the tablets of the law at Sinai, the 40-year pilgrimage in the desert, were not written by eyewitnesses contemporary to the events, but rather by anonymous authors who lived 500 to 1,000 years later, compiling diverse oral traditions in specific political contexts, the question of the historicity of these events changes dramatically. It is not to say that none of this happened. It is to say that what happened probably happened very differently from what the texts, in their final form, suggest. Modern archaeology, by the way, has confirmed this intuition. Extensive excavations conducted in the Sinai Peninsula throughout the 20th century found absolutely no archaeological evidence corresponding to a mass migration of hundreds of thousands of people through the desert for 40 years. No campsite, no cemetery, no artifact, nothing, which is at the very least strange, considering that contemporary Bedouins, passing through the same regions in much smaller groups, leave abundant archaeological traces. Likewise, the swift conquest of Canaan narrated in the book of Joshua finds no archaeological confirmation. The cities supposedly destroyed by Joshua, such as Jericho and Ai, had already been abandoned centuries before the time of the supposed event. This indicates that the biblical narratives are likely later literary constructions made for specific theological and political purposes, and not historical chronicles in the modern sense. Now applying the same method to the Gospels, Spinoza made equally compelling observations. He noted that the Gospels were written in Greek, although Jesus and his early disciples spoke Aramaic. He noted that the Gospels initially circulated without titles, and that the attributions to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were added much later, in the 2nd century, when the Church felt the need to anchor these texts in authorized apostolic names. He noted that the Gospels contradict each other on fundamental factual points. How many women went to the tomb on Easter morning? Mark says 3, Matthew says 2, Luke says 5 or more. John mentions only Mary Magdalene. Who did they find at the empty tomb? A young man in Mark, an angel in Matthew, 2 men in Luke, 2 angels in John. What did Jesus say on the cross? Mark and Matthew record, my God, why have you forsaken me? Luke records, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing, and Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. John records, I thirst, it is finished, and woman, here is your son. These are not small variations of emphasis, they are factual contradictions, and they indicate, unequivocally, that the Gospels are not direct eyewitness testimonies, but literary compositions made decades later, in different communities, with different traditions, with different theological objectives, which does not mean, of course, that they do not preserve anything historical. It merely means that to recover the historical Jesus from these texts, a critical, careful methodology is needed that distinguishes between the oldest and most reliable strata and the later strata of theological development. This methodology was developed by scholarship after Spinoza. Researchers such as David Strauss, Ernest Renan, Albert Schweitzer, Rudolf Bultmann, and more recently, members of the Jesus Seminar, John Dominic Crossan, Bart Ehrman, Dale Allison, among many others, have dedicated themselves to this archaeological task of reconstruction. And the portraits they produced, although varying in details, coincide in fundamental traits. The historical Jesus that emerges from this research is an apocalyptic Jew, a wandering preacher, a popular exorcist, a social critic, a prophet of imminent divine intervention, a man deeply rooted in the Jewish tradition of his time, a man who probably did not consider himself divine in the Nicene sense, a man very different in many respects from the cosmic figure that later councils consecrated. And what Spinoza did, viewer, was open that door. Before him, this investigation was literally impossible because it was forbidden. After him, it became inevitable. All biblical scholarship of the last 3.5 centuries walks, directly or indirectly, along the path he opened in 1670, at the cost of his excommunication, his near assassination, his exiled solitude, his tattered coat hanging on the wall of his room. There is a famous painting in the golden mosaic ceiling of the Hagia Sophia Basilica in Istanbul. It is a painting from the 10th century. In it, Jesus is seated on an imperial throne, dressed in purple and gold, with a cruciform halo behind his head, holding a book in one hand and raising the other, in a gesture of authoritative blessing. Beside him, kneeling, is a Byzantine emperor, Leo VI, with the crown on his head, but bent in a posture of a subject. The message of the composition is clear. Christ is the Emperor of Emperors, the King of Kings, the cosmic Lord whose authority transcends and legitimizes the authority of earthly emperors. The figure is majestic, solemn, severe. The eyes look at the viewer with an intensity that is simultaneously comforting and terrifying. Now imagine for a moment that you could place side by side this imperial image of Christ and a realistic photograph, which unfortunately does not exist, of the Rabbi Yeshua bar Yosef, walking barefoot along the dirt roads of Galilee in the year 29 of our era. A short man, sunburned skin, disheveled beard, tunic dirty from the dust of the road. A man who, according to the Gospels themselves, was repeatedly mistaken by strangers for just any simple traveler. So much so that his disciples, after the resurrection, do not immediately recognize him on the road to Emmaus. A man who, if he appeared today on a street in any Brazilian city, would go completely unnoticed or perhaps be mistaken for a beggar. Place these two images side by side, viewer, and ask yourself honestly, are these two figures the same person? The metamorphosis between one and the other, the process by which a messianic preacher from occupied Palestine died and a cosmic emperor enthroned in Byzantine mosaics resurrected, is this metamorphosis explained by the action of the Holy Spirit throughout the history of the Church? Or is it explained, much more prosaically, by the cultural, political, and institutional dynamics that inevitably transform any religious figure absorbed by great empires? Spinoza bet on the second explanation, and history, when examined in its details, tends to vindicate him. Let's follow, step by step, how this transformation occurred. In the 1st century, in the oldest writings we have, Jesus is described in humble terms. Paul, who is the earliest author of the New Testament, with letters dated from the 50s AD, refers to Jesus as the Son of God, the Christ, the Lord. But these designations in the Jewish context of the 1st century did not carry the cosmic weight they would later acquire. Calling someone the Son of God, in ancient Judaism, could simply mean that he was a particularly righteous person, close to God, graced by divinity. King David was called the Son of God in the Psalms. Angels were called sons of God in Job. Even the people of Israel, collectively, were called the firstborn Son of God in Exodus. Therefore, the expression applied to Jesus initially did not imply metaphysical divinity. It implied choice, predilection, special mission. In the 2nd century, however, a significant change begins. Christian apologists like Justin Martyr, who wrote in Greek for intellectually Hellenized audiences, began to interpret Jesus in terms of Platonic philosophy. Justin, in his first apology, addressed to the Roman emperor around 150 AD, presents Jesus as the divine Logos, the eternal reason of God. That same reason that Greek philosophers had glimpsed in their metaphysical speculations. This interpretation allowed Christianity to be presented to the cultured elites of the empire as the culmination of Greek philosophical traditions, rather than as a strange sect from the Jewish East. It was a cultural marketing operation, if we will, but it was also a genuine reinterpretation in which Jesus was progressively detached from his original Jewish context and re-anchored in a Greek conceptual matrix. In the 3rd century, with theologians like Origen of Alexandria, this Hellenization deepens even further. Origen, one of the brightest Christian intellectuals of the early centuries, develops a highly speculative theology in which Jesus is presented as the pre-existent divine wisdom, the first emanation of the Father, an eternal being but subordinate to the Father. It is still, in certain aspects, a theology closer to what would become Arianism than to the Nicene position. Origen even believed in the pre-existence of human souls and the possibility of universal salvation, including of demons, positions that would be posthumously condemned by the Second Council of Constantinople in 553 AD, more than 300 years after his death. And then comes Nicaea in 325, as we have already discussed. The formula homoousios, consubstantial with the Father, is imposed as dogma, but this imposition did not end the disputes. On the contrary, throughout the 4th century, the Roman Empire was torn apart in a theological political war between Nicenes and Arians. Successive emperors took different sides. Constantius II, son of Constantine, favored the Arians. Julian, the apostate, tried to restore paganism. Valens, in the east, persecuted the Nicenes. Only with Theodosius I, starting in 380, was the Nicene Creed definitively imposed as the official religion of the empire, through the Edict of Thessalonica. In this edict, Theodosius declared that all Roman citizens should adhere to the Nicene faith, and that those who did not would be considered not only heretics but also enemies of the state, subject to civil penalties. Christianity, from a persecuted religion, became a persecuting religion in less than 80 years. A bitter historical irony. At that time, the figure of Christ began to be painted, literally, with imperial attributes. The mosaics and frescoes of the 4th and 5th centuries show Jesus seated on thrones, dressed in purple togas, surrounded by celestial courts that accurately reproduce the Roman imperial courts. The term Pantocrator, which in Greek means all-powerful, began to be systematically applied to him. This title had previously been used for Zeus in pagan religion and for the Jewish god in the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. Its transfer to Jesus symbolically completed his identification with the previous imperial deities. The Byzantine emperor came to be considered the earthly representative of Christ, Pantocrator, his vicar in the material world, just as, centuries later, in the West, the Pope would claim the same title of vicar of Christ for himself. This is a fundamental detail, viewer, that goes unnoticed by most people. The relationship between political power and religious power in imperial Christianity was not one of separation, but of symbiosis. The emperor needed the church to legitimize his power before the people, presenting himself as chosen and blessed by Christ. The church needed the emperor to impose its dogmas on dissenters, having the secular arm of the state as executor of its condemnations. This symbiosis had decisive consequences on how Christ came to be presented. If Christ was the cosmic emperor, the earthly emperor was his lieutenant. If the earthly emperor ruled subjects who owed him absolute obedience, the cosmic Christ ruled believers who owed him absolute faith. The structures mirrored each other. Political obedience and religious obedience reinforced one another. In this context, the original message of Jesus, that message of a Galilean rabbi preaching the imminence of the kingdom of God, the inversion of the world's values, the blessedness of the poor and the persecuted, the curse of the rich and the powerful, this message became extremely inconvenient. Because if taken seriously, it would undermine exactly the power structures that the imperial church was helping to legitimize. How can an opulent emperor, living in palaces with porphyry walls and marble floors, served by slaves and eunuchs, truly follow a master who said, "Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of God"? How can a church accumulating vast properties, bishops wearing golden vestments, cathedrals built with the labor of peasants, remain faithful to a master who said it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven? The solution was to spiritualize, to reinterpret, to say that when Jesus spoke of the poor, he referred to the poor in spirit, to the humble of heart, and not to the materially poor. To say that when he spoke of the rich, he referred to those attached to possessions, and not to those who simply own goods. To say that the kingdom of God is not of this world, as John puts in the mouth of Jesus judicially interrogated by Pilate, and therefore the structures of this world can be maintained as they are, because the kingdom will be experienced elsewhere, after death, in a transcendent reality that does not confuse with the material reality. This operation of spiritualization, progressively carried out over the centuries, transformed Christianity from a revolutionary messianic movement into an instrument for conserving existing social orders. Where the historical Jesus subverted, the imperial Christ legitimized. Where the historical Jesus denounced the scribes and Pharisees, the imperial Christ blessed bishops and cardinals. Where the historical Jesus expelled the money changers from the temple, the imperial Christ was sold in indulgences at the cathedral doors. The metamorphosis was almost complete, but observe, it was not entirely complete, because the original message was never entirely erased from the canonical texts. The Gospels continued to preserve, in their oldest layers, those uncomfortable words of the Galilean rabbi. The Beatitudes continued to be read in masses. The parables continued to be retold. And over the centuries, figures always emerged who, rereading these texts with new eyes, rediscovered the revolutionary dimension of the primitive message. Francis of Assisi, in the 13th century, abandoning all the wealth of his family to live in absolute poverty, in direct emulation of Jesus. The spiritual Franciscan movements, later condemned as heretical by the popes, for insisting on evangelical poverty in a way that disturbed the structures of the established church. The Waldensians, the Cathars, the Lollards, the Hussites, all those medieval popular movements that were persecuted with bonfires and crusades, because they had the audacity to take the original words of Jesus more seriously than the official church deemed convenient. The historical Jesus, therefore, although buried under layers of imperial reinterpretation, was never completely silenced. He remained alive, underground, in margins, in dissidences, in anonymous martyrs who would rather die than renounce the original message. And it was from these margins, these dissidences, that men like Spinoza inherited the courage to, for the first time, articulate all this in a rational, systematic book, directed at the educated public of his time. If everything that the Church taught us about Christ for 2 millennia is largely a later construction, political, imperial, edited and re-edited by men with very concrete interests, then an inevitable question arises, the question that deep down is the only one that really matters in all this investigation, the question that perhaps you have kept deep in your chest since you started watching this video, without allowing yourself to formulate it out loud. The question is this, and then, after all, what did Jesus really teach? What was, beneath all these layers, the original message of the rabbi from Galilee? This question seems impossible at first glance. How to reconstruct the voice of a man who died 2,000 years ago, whose words were transmitted orally for decades, then written in a language different from the one he spoke, then successively edited by generations of copyists, then interpreted by councils and dogmatized by institutions. It seems a task for archaeologists digging deep ruins, and it is in fact, but it is a possible archaeology, because the texts, although heavily edited, still preserve in their oldest layers undeniable traces of the original man, and these traces, when identified with the correct criteria, allow us to reconstruct with reasonable probability the essential profile of the historical message. Modern scholars have developed, over the last century, several criteria to distinguish what is most likely authentic from what is most likely later. One of the main ones is the criterion of dissimilarity. If a word or action attributed to Jesus in the Gospels contradicts both the Judaism of his time and the positions of the later church, then it is very likely to be authentic because no one would have invented something that disturbed so much the environments that produced the texts. Another criterion is that of multiple attestation. If a phrase or action appears in independent sources, such as Mark, the reconstructed Q source, Thomas and Paul, for example, then it is very likely to date back to the historical Jesus, because it is more difficult for several separate traditions to invent the same thing. Another criterion is that of embarrassment. If something in the texts seems embarrassing for the church that preserved it, such as Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist, which suggests subordination, or the cry of abandonment on the cross, which suggests doubt, then it is likely to have been preserved because it was too genuine a memory to be erased, despite the discomfort it caused. By applying these criteria rigorously, scholars have arrived at a reasonably consensual image of the historical Jesus, at least in its broadest strokes. And this image, I will tell you, is surprising. It is different from the Jesus of the Catechism. It is different from the Christ of Sunday homilies. But it is much, much more human, and, perhaps for that very reason, much more powerful. The first fundamental trait is that Jesus was a Jew. Everything about him begins and ends in the Judaism of the first century. He was born a Jew, grew up a Jew, lived a Jew, died a Jew. He attended synagogues, celebrated the Hebrew Passover, recited prayers in Hebrew, discussed the Torah with other teachers, never at any moment thought of founding a new religion separate from Judaism. This is perhaps the most important historical correction that modern studies impose on us. Christianity, as an autonomous religion separate from Judaism, is a later reality, much later. A reality that crystallized mainly after the destruction of the Temple in 70 AD and the defeat of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD. Jesus, during his life, was a reformer within Judaism, as had been before him the prophets Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah. His message was addressed to Israel, not to the nations. The second fundamental trait is that Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher. He believed that the end of history, as it was known, was imminent. He believed that God was about to intervene dramatically in the world, destroying unjust powers such as the Roman Empire and the priestly aristocracy of Jerusalem, and establishing the kingdom of God as a concrete, visible, historical reality. This kingdom was not initially a spiritual metaphor for the afterlife. It was an event expected to happen soon, during the living generation. Jesus insisted repeatedly, and this repetition is attested by multiple independent sources, that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. He believed this literally, and his first followers also believed. It was only when the years passed without the kingdom arriving, and the original disciples died one by one without seeing the fulfillment of the promise, that the message began to be reinterpreted in a spiritualized key. The third fundamental trait is that Jesus was a radical social critic. His strongest words, those that critics recognize as most authentic, are directed against the rich, against the powerful, against religious hypocrites. The Beatitudes, in their oldest preserved version in Luke chapter 6, are brutal. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be satisfied. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Notice in Luke, the version is much sharper than in Matthew, where it is already softened to blessed are the poor in spirit. The Lucan version, which scholars consider closer to the original Aramaic, speaks of real poor, real hungry, real mourners. It speaks of the concrete inversion of the world's social hierarchies. The last will be first, the first will be last. It is not theological poetry, it is a messianic program. The fourth trait is that Jesus was a popular healer and exorcist. This dimension is often underestimated or displaced by modern scholars who, due to their rationalist training, have difficulty dealing with it. But historically it is undeniable. Ancient sources, both Christian and non-Christian, agree in attributing to Jesus a reputation as a miracle worker. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus calls him a doer of wonderful works. The Talmud accuses him of practicing magic. The Gospels narrate dozens of healings and exorcisms. In the context of first-century Palestinian Judaism, this was not exceptional in itself. Other charismatic teachers, such as Honi the Circle Drawer or Hanina ben Dosa, were known for similar abilities. What distinguished Jesus was the apocalyptic context in which he inscribed his healings. Each exorcism was, for him, a sign of the kingdom's imminence, a foretaste of the cosmic defeat of evil. "If I cast out demons by the finger of God," he said, "then the kingdom of God has come upon you." The fifth trait is that Jesus taught an ethics of radical compassion, that ethics which was, paradoxically, the part of his message that had the most historical success, although it is also the part most frequently betrayed by the institutions that claim to be his. Love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, offer the other also. If someone asks you for your coat, give your cloak as well. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. Forgive 70 times 7. These words, in their barest form, represent an ethical program so demanding that practically no one can live by it fully. Neither Christians, nor churches, nor popes, nor reformers. And this, curiously, is the best sign of its authenticity. No one would have invented, for a new religion that intended to spread and prosper, a set of ethical demands so radical that they would make the institutional survival of any movement that took them seriously almost impossible. The sixth trait, and perhaps the most delicate of all, is that Jesus seems to have had a very peculiar consciousness of his own mission. Here, scholars diverge quite a bit. Some, like Albert Schweitzer and Bart Ehrman, argue that Jesus likely considered himself the Son of Man, an apocalyptic figure mentioned in the book of Daniel, who would come on the clouds of heaven to judge the nations. Others, like John Dominic Crossan, argue that Jesus saw himself primarily as a non-violent social reformer inspired by the prophets. Still others, like E.P. Sanders, argue that Jesus himself did not attribute specific messianic titles to himself, but that these titles were applied to him after his death by his followers. The truth is that we will probably never know for sure exactly how Jesus conceived of himself. But what is clear is that his self-perception was very distant from the Nicene dogma of consubstantial divinity with the Father. He likely saw himself as a prophet and instrument of divine intervention, but not as God incarnate in the later sense. The seventh trait, finally, is that Jesus died a political death. He was executed by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, by the method reserved for political agitators against the Roman state. Crucifixion was not a religious penalty. It was a Roman penalty, specifically directed against rebellious slaves, robbers, and revolutionaries. The very inscription placed above the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, reveals the political nature of the execution. For Rome, Jesus was executed because he represented a political threat, as someone who preached a kingdom that was not the empire. This dimension was progressively erased in the later Gospels, in which the responsibility for Jesus' death is increasingly transferred from the Romans to the Jews, in an operation of reconciliation of Christianity with the Roman Empire that would have tragic consequences for Jewish communities in the following centuries, fueling the Christian anti-Semitism that would produce so many catastrophes up to the 20th century. This is, in very brief summary, the figure of the historical Jesus that emerges from contemporary research. An apocalyptic Jewish prophet, poor, marginalized, radical social critic, popular healer, preacher of an extreme compassion ethics, politically executed by Rome, and whose followers, after his death, began a long process of reinterpretation of his person and message. It is a human, passionate, tragic figure, deeply rooted in his time and his people. It is also a figure that surprisingly continues to speak. Because stripped of later theological constructions, it reveals a spiritual authenticity that may be more compelling than any dogma. There was a letter that Spinoza received in 1673, 3 years after publishing the theological political treatise and 4 years before his death. The letter came from Heidelberg, Germany, and was signed by Johann Ludwig Fabricius, a professor of theology at the university of that city. In it, on behalf of the Palatine Elector Charles Louis, a chair of philosophy was offered to Spinoza, one of the most prestigious academic positions in Central Europe, with a considerable salary, with the security of belonging to an institution protected by a prince, with the possibility of finally leaving the poverty of rented rooms, of working with lenses, of a hidden life. The letter, however, contained a clause. The elector, said the polite lines of Fabricius, granted him the broadest freedom to philosophize, confident that he would not use this freedom to publicly disturb the established religion. Spinoza read this letter in silence. He read it a second time, he read it a third, and then he sat down at his small desk, took a sheet of paper, and wrote the most elegant and devastating response in the history of academic refusal. He thanked for the honor. He expressed his deep respect for the elector. He mentioned his affection for those who cultivated love for the truth. And then, with the sobriety of someone who had mentally closed the doors that were offered to him, he wrote a sentence that I would like you to remember for the rest of your life. He wrote, "I do not know to what limits my philosophical freedom should be contained, so that I do not seem to want to disturb the publicly established religion." And he added, "Schisms arise, in fact, not so much from a burning love for religion, but from various affections of men or from the spirit of contradiction. In other words, amicably, firmly, irrevocably, he refused. He refused the chair. He refused the salary. He refused princely protection. He refused security. He refused everything, because he knew that by accepting he would have to accept, along with it, an invisible shackle, the shackle of political convenience, the shackle of silencing on certain matters, what the truth would require to be said. And he was not willing to do that. He had made a choice 20 years earlier, when he was expelled from the synagogue, and he would not go back. Never. Spinoza lived 4 more years after that letter. He lived polishing lenses in small rooms, never marrying, never acquiring any wealth, never holding any prestigious chair, never having numerous disciples or public recognition. He died at the age of 44 on February 21, 1677, in The Hague, probably from tuberculosis aggravated by inhaling, for decades, the glass dust produced by his polishing work. He died poor. He died practically alone. At his funeral, few close friends attended and some intellectuals who had known him. He was buried in a simple grave, in the yard of a Reformed church in The Hague, a grave that, by the irony of ironies, disappeared over the years, the exact location of which no one knows for sure today. And yet, spectator, this poor death was, in fact, the seed of one of the most enduring intellectual revolutions in Western history. Because Spinoza left, hidden in a chest, the manuscript of another work, even more explosive than the theological political treatise, a work that he never published in his lifetime, knowing that if he did, he would be pursued until the last day of his days. This work is called Ethics, and it was published by his friends a few months after his death. In it, Spinoza proposes a vision of the universe so vast, so radical, so original, that even today, more than 350 years later, it continues to be the subject of study, admiration, and controversy. In it, he proposes that God and nature are one and the same reality, that everything that exists is an expression of divine substance, that there is no transcendence in the traditional sense, a God outside the world creating the world from nothing. There is total immanence, a God who is the very being of all things, manifesting in the stars, in the rocks, in animals, in human beings, in thoughts. This view, which his detractors immediately labeled as pantheism, which is the pejorative term that traditional theologians use to disqualify it, had an immense influence over the subsequent centuries. Goethe declared himself a Spinozist. Hegel said that to be a philosopher is to begin with Spinoza. Nietzsche, in a famous letter to his friend Overbeck, wrote that he had found a predecessor, and what a predecessor in Spinoza, whose general tendency was like his own. Einstein, when directly asked if he believed in God, replied, "I believe in the God of Spinoza, who reveals himself in the ordered harmony of what exists." But at this point, we can already ask the question that has probably been on your mind since the beginning of this video. Why did Spinoza, after all, pay such a high price? Why? Instead of simply remaining silent, instead of accommodating himself, instead of accepting the chair and living a comfortable life, did he choose the path of solitude, poverty, and excommunication? What drove that man? The answer, spectator, lies in a sentence he wrote in the Ethics, which is perhaps the key to understanding all his work and all his life. He wrote that the wise man never thinks less of death, and his wisdom is a meditation not on death, but on life. Spinoza believed that life, true life, is incompatible with lies, that living in an accepted lie, even if comfortable, is a form of death in life, that the only authentic form of existence is one in which one seeks the truth, even when the truth demands high prices. He did not see his excommunication as a punishment, nor his poverty as a disgrace, nor his solitude as a deprivation. He saw all of this as the natural price of philosophical freedom, and this price for him infinitely compensated what he received in return: the possibility of thinking without shackles, of writing without internal censorship, of looking at the world without the veils that institutions impose on their members. And what does this have to do, spectator, with our initial question about the historical Jesus and the Christ of the Church? It has everything to do with it, because Spinoza's fidelity to the truth, even at the exorbitant price he paid, is in itself a form of deep imitation of Jesus, of the historical Jesus, that man who preferred to die on a Roman cross rather than retreat from the message he deemed true. That man who, in the Garden of Gethsemane, according to the oldest narratives, asked that the cup be taken from him because he was afraid, because he was human, because the suffering that awaited him was real and terrible, but who in the end said, "Not my will, but yours be done." This Jesus, this man, is the one whom Spinoza, in his own way, imitated. Not the cosmic Christ of the basilicas, not the emperor of the golden mosaics, but the Jewish rabbi who preferred to die than to be silent. And there is an even deeper connection, which perhaps is only now beginning to become visible. Spinoza, by writing against political theology, by denouncing the use of the sacred as an instrument of domination, was on the same subterranean line that Jesus was on when he expelled the money changers from the temple. When Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, he was saying with forceful gestures that the sacred had been corrupted, transformed into a market, placed at the service of the interests of the powerful. He was denouncing, in the very heart of the institutional Judaism of his time, the capture of the divine by the mechanisms of earthly power. Spinoza, 16 centuries later, made the same denunciation, only directed against the institution that had paradoxically been born in the name of that same rabbi. He denounced the Christian church for the same reasons that Jesus had denounced the Temple of Jerusalem, the corruption of the sacred by power, the transformation of religious experience into ideological merchandise, the manipulation of faith for political domination purposes. There is a phrase in the theological political treatise that summarizes all of this in a striking way. Spinoza wrote that the great secret of the monarchical regime and its supreme interest is to keep men deceived and to disguise under the specious name of religion the fear by which they intend to restrain them, so that they fight for their slavery as if they were fighting for their salvation. Read that sentence again, spectator. Read it slowly, because it describes with brutal precision the mechanism by which all authoritarian powers in history have used religion to control the people. And it also describes why the original message of Jesus, that message which denounced those same powers, had to be carefully made up by the ecclesiastical institutions that inherited his name. Spinoza saw this. He saw all of this, and he wrote, and he paid the price, because he understood that there is a type of courage, the rarest of all, that consists of thinking what others are afraid to think and saying what others are afraid to say. This type of courage is not heroic in the traditional sense. It does not involve swords or horses or bloody battles. It involves a pen, a sheet of paper, a candle burning on a cold night, and the solitary willingness not to be silent. When you, spectator, in a few years remember this video, I hope you remember this detail. That the truth, the real truth, the one that truly liberates, is always uncomfortable. It is always pursued. It is always spoken in a low voice, in marginal places, by men and women who pay a price for speaking it. But it is also, precisely for that reason, the only thing that, in the end, remains. Empires pass, cathedrals crumble, dogmas become obsolete, but true words, those that were spoken at the price of solitude and blood, continue to echo, generation after generation, finding in each era new ears capable of hearing them. Imagine a morning in 1674 in The Hague. The fog rises from the canals. The church bell tolls 9 deep chimes. And, in the center of the city, in a small pile of wood set up in the square, men in black robes stack copies of a book without an author's name. They pour oil. They light the torch. The flames rise, and the pages of the theological political treatise curl, darken, crumble into ashes that the wind carries over the rooftops. This spectacle was repeated in dozens of European cities over the decades. In Rome, in Amsterdam, in Paris, in Cologne, in Madrid. Spinoza's book was officially banned by the Congregation of the Index in 1679, 2 years after his death. It was placed on the list of cursed books. Any Catholic who possessed, lent, or quoted it would be subject to automatic excommunication. The Dutch Reformed Church, which had been relatively tolerant of the philosopher during his lifetime, joined the chorus of posthumous condemnations. The European Sephardic rabbis renewed the cherem against his memory. The Lutherans in Wittenberg published fiery refutations. The Calvinists in Geneva organized special chairs to teach why Spinoza was wrong. And yet, the book did not die. That is the fascinating point. No matter how much it was burned, how much it was prohibited, how much it was defamed, it continued to circulate, in clandestine handwritten copies, in printed editions with false covers, in secret translations distributed by underground networks of readers. Throughout the entire 18th century, Spinoza was the most read prohibited author in Europe. French Enlightenment intellectuals, such as Voltaire, Diderot, D'Holbach, drank from him in silence. German philosophers, such as Lessing, Mendelssohn, Jacobi, discussed him in private letters that circulated from hand to hand. English thinkers, such as Toland and Collins, translated and popularized him for broader audiences. Why does a prohibited book become irresistible? I give you the answer that Spinoza himself would have given. Because the human mind, when free, has a natural inclination towards the truth. It may be contained for some time, it may be frightened by bonfires, it may be seduced by rewards, but in the end, it always seeks what resonates with reality. And the theological political treatise resonated. It resonated because it said out loud what many already suspected in silence. And this effect, spectator, is what authoritarian institutions fear the most, not the isolated dissident, but the possibility that the isolated dissident articulates in clear language the dispersed suspicions of millions. There was one case in particular that illustrates all of this impressively. A young citizen of Amsterdam named Adriaan Courbag, who had been a personal friend of Spinoza, published in 1668, 2 years before the treatise, a book of his own authorship, in which he defended similar ideas. The reaction was immediate. Courbag was arrested, interrogated, judged, sentenced to 10 years of hard labor, to pay a ruinous fine, and to have his right thumb severed so that he could never write again. He died in prison just over a year later, at the age of 36, exhausted by the brutality of the prison regime. Spinoza, who had long conversed with his friend about those ideas, closely followed the process, and it was this case, more than any other, that convinced him to publish his own book anonymously, with a false publisher, false city, without revealing his authorship for many years. This lesson, from Courbag's fate, is one of the bitterest in European intellectual history. It shows that even in Amsterdam, considered the most tolerant city in Europe at that time, freedom of thought was conditional, monitored, punished when it exceeded certain limits. And it also shows that the difference between courage and recklessness, between courage and useless suicide, is a fine line. Spinoza walked that fine line throughout his life. He paid a high price, yes, but he did not pay the price of Kurbag, because he knew with the wisdom of the persecuted how to choose his battles. He knew how to wait for the right moment. He knew which words to say and which to omit. And above all, he knew that his most important work, the Ethics, would only be published after his death when no one could punish him for it. There is a moment in reading Spinoza's Ethics when the attentive reader feels a specific kind of vertigo. It is the moment when he realizes what Spinoza is really saying, not about sacred texts, not about the church, not about politics, but about God. Because Spinoza, in the book he kept hidden until his death, proposed a conception of God so different from that of traditional Judaism and Christianity that he practically invented a new form of Western spirituality. Spinoza's thesis, in simple terms, is as follows. God is not a being separate from the world, sitting on a heavenly throne, creating things from nothing, intervening from time to time in human history through miracles or special revelations. God is, in fact, the very unique substance of reality. Everything that exists exists in God. Everything that happens happens because it is a necessary expression of divine nature. There is no outside of God. There is no inside of God, in the sense of a contrast between interior and exterior. There is only God, whom Spinoza also calls nature, these two words being, for him, two names for the same infinite reality. He formulated this in a famous Latin expression, Deus sive natura, God or nature. Not God and nature as two distinct beings, God or nature as two words for the same thing. God is nature seen in its productive, generative, active aspect. Nature is God seen in its produced, expressed, manifested aspect. There is no creation from nothing. There is no ontological separation between creator and creature. There is a single infinite reality which expresses itself eternally in infinite modes and infinite attributes. This thesis, when it appeared, was immediately denounced as disguised atheism. The theologians argued that a God who confuses with the world is, in practice, the denial of God. A God without personhood, without will, without providence, without paternal love for creatures, would not be, strictly speaking, God. It would be just a sophisticated name for universal matter. Spinoza's adversaries, throughout the centuries, insisted on this accusation, but if we read carefully, we realize that Spinoza did exactly the opposite of what he was accused of. He did not deny God. He infinitely amplified God. He took God out of the small prisons in which institutional religions had confined him. A God who is a person resembling an old man with a white beard, a God who has jealousy, anger, national preferences, exclusive pacts with certain peoples, a God who needs temples, priests, tithes. Spinoza looked at this small God and said, no, God is infinitely greater than that. The God of Spinoza is everything that exists, in its infinite totality. It is the mathematical order that governs the stars and atoms. It is the energy that traverses magnetic fields and neurons. It is the immanent intelligence that manifests in every living form, in every human thought, in every emotion. It is what the mystics of all traditions, when they abandoned the literalist formulations of their religions, tried to describe when speaking of the experience of the sacred. It is what Eckhart, in medieval German Christianity, called Gottheit, the divinity beyond God. It is what Hindu philosophers called Brahman, the ultimate formless reality. It is what Chinese Taoists called Tao, the ineffable cosmic way. And here is the extraordinary point. This God, notice, is deeply compatible with the deepest spiritual experience of Jesus himself, because the Rabbi of Galilee, although he spoke in the vocabulary of the Judaism of his time, seems to have experienced the divine in a way that went far beyond the tribal formulations of his people. When he said the kingdom of God is within you, he was saying something very close to what Spinoza would say 16 centuries later. When he said, I and the Father are one, a phrase preserved in the Gospel of John, he was anticipating a Spinozist intuition that the separation between the divine and the human is ultimately illusory. When he taught his followers to say, Our Father who art in heaven, he was using language familiar to his time, but pointing to a reality that no paternal image can contain. This convergence between the spiritual experience of the historical Jesus and the philosophical formulation of Spinoza is one of the most fascinating things in this story. Both were, in their own way, dissidents within Judaism. Both were persecuted by the established religious authorities. Both paid with their own lives for the audacity of taking the experience of the divine to its ultimate consequences. And both, paradoxically, opened paths that their persecutors, in the following generations, would try to close or redirect. The ethics, therefore, should not be read merely as a philosophical treatise, although it is that too. It should be read as a spiritual exercise, a manual for the reader who wishes to find the sacred outside of institutions without denying the sacred. A guide for those who, disillusioned with organized religions, do not want to fall into shallow atheism, but want to find a higher, more rigorous, more truthful form of relationship with the mystery of being. Spinoza offered this path, and those who have walked it over the centuries have witnessed that, at the end of it, one does not find a nihilistic desert. One finds, on the contrary, a renewed astonishment before the infinite reality, an intellectual love of God, as Spinoza himself called it, which is, according to him, the highest form of happiness that a human being can achieve. In Chapter 6 of the theological political treatise, Spinoza does something that, by the standards of his time, was so shocking that it seemed almost a war cry against all of Christendom. He dedicates an entire chapter to the question of miracles, and he demonstrates, with a rational calm that infuriates his orthodox readers, that miracles, in the traditional sense of the word, simply cannot exist. His argument is elegant and demolishing. If God is, as he demonstrated in the previous chapters, the very necessary and eternal order of nature, then any event that occurs in nature is, by definition, an expression of that divine order. There is no way for God to act against the laws of nature, because the laws of nature are the very expression of God's essence. To say that God performs a miracle, in the sense of violating natural laws, is the same as saying that God acts against himself, which is a logical contradiction. Therefore, what ordinary people call a miracle is, in fact, either a natural event whose causes they do not yet understand, or a narrative construction elaborated later, based on common events, for religious or political purposes. This thesis, seemingly simple, has enormous implications. It implies that the biblical narratives of miracles, both from the Old Testament and the New, should not be read as literal accounts of violations of natural laws, but as literary constructions with specific purposes. The crossing of the Red Sea, the multiplication of the loaves, the resurrection of Lazarus, the walking on water, the very resurrection of Jesus. All these narratives, according to Spinoza, should be understood in the cultural and rhetorical context in which they were produced, not as historical documentation of supernatural interventions. Note that Spinoza is not necessarily saying that nothing happened. He is saying that, if something happened, it happened within the laws of nature, and that the amplified narratives we receive in the texts are the result of the cultural process of interpretation, transmission, and dramatization. The cures attributed to Jesus, for example, may very well have occurred, in the sense that he exerted real psychosomatic effects on people suffering from psychologically rooted diseases, something that modern medicine confirms happens frequently in contexts of strong suggestion and faith. But the interpretation of these cures as violations of natural laws, as miracles in the supernatural sense, is posterior to the event and reflects the conceptual framework of the narrators, not the reality of the facts. This perspective, when Spinoza formulated it in 1670, was absolutely revolutionary, and more importantly, it anticipated by 2 centuries the entire tradition of historical criticism of miracles, which would come to be systematically developed in the 19th century with David Strauss, Ernest Renan, Albert Reville, and many others. Strauss, in his monumental Life of Jesus, published in 1835, would rigorously apply the Spinozist method to the Gospels, demonstrating that most of the miracles narrated can be explained as mythical constructions elaborated by the early Christian community based on literary models already existing in the ancient world. The book by Strauss caused such a scandal that it cost him his university chair, but it established the foundations of modern biblical criticism. And here, viewer, I ask for your attention to a particularly delicate point. Dismantling miracles, in the traditional sense, does not mean emptying religious experience. On the contrary, it means freeing it from a childish dependence on external wonders. A God who needs to violate the laws of nature to manifest is, according to Spinoza, a small God, imagined in the likeness of sorcerers and magicians. The true God, that God who is the very order of the universe, manifests in everything, all the time, in every leaf that falls, in every star that shines, in every human thought that occurs. He does not need supernatural fireworks to be noticed. He is present eternally in every moment of existence for those who have eyes to see. This vision has, curiously, much more affinity with the very religious experience of the historical Jesus than with later ecclesiastical theology. Because Jesus, according to the most attentive scholars, seems to have seen the extraordinary events surrounding him not as supernatural breaks in the cosmic order, but as signs of the immanent presence of the kingdom amidst everyday reality. When he said, "The kingdom of God is among you," or "the kingdom of God is within you," he was pointing to a dimension of the sacred that does not depend on prodigious spectacles, but reveals itself in the very density of common human experience when it is lived with the appropriate depth and attention. If there is a figure from early Christianity that has suffered such systematic, premeditated, cultural erasure as the historical Jesus himself, that figure is Mary Magdalene. And the story of this erasure, when told in its details, is so revealing of the institutional workings of the Church that it deserves a separate chapter in our investigation. Let us return to the facts. In the 4 canonical Gospels, without exception, Mary Magdalene appears in a singularly prominent position. She is mentioned more times than any of the male apostles except for Peter. She accompanies Jesus throughout his ministry, financing it with her own resources, according to Luke chapter 8. She is at the foot of the cross, when almost all the apostles had fled. She is the first person to go to the tomb on Easter morning. She is the first to see the resurrected Christ. She is sent by him to announce the resurrection to the apostles. She is, in a technical and precise sense, the first apostle of Christianity. Note that, by the very linguistic rules of ancient Greek, apostle literally means one who is sent. If we consider apostle to be one who was commissioned by the resurrected Christ to proclaim the gospel to others, then Mary Magdalene is, chronologically, the first on that list, before Peter, before John, before James, even before Paul, who would boast so much in his letters about his status as an apostle because of the vision he had on the road to Damascus. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, this position of Mary Magdalene was still remembered in certain Christian communities. This is revealed by texts such as the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, and several others found in Nag Hammadi. In the Gospel of Philip, there is a particularly revealing passage that states that Mary Magdalene was the companion of Jesus, and that he loved her more than the other disciples, kissing her frequently. The text is partially corrupted at crucial points, but the spiritual intimacy between them is clearly affirmed. In the Gospel of Mary, she receives secret teachings directly from Jesus after the resurrection, which the other apostles did not know. Peter in the text feels resentful and questions why the master would have preferred a woman to men. Levi rebukes him, saying that the master indeed knew her very well, and that is why he loved her more than the others. These traditions, preserved in texts considered apocryphal by the triumphant churches, were systematically marginalized over the centuries as Christianity institutionalized under Roman patriarchal structures. The presence of a woman as the first apostle became theologically inconvenient for a church that wished to restrict the priesthood to men. And the fate of Mary Magdalene, in the official Christian imagination, was progressively rewritten. The decisive operation occurred in the year 591 when Pope Gregory the Great, in a paschal homily delivered in Rome, arbitrarily fused 3 distinct women from the Gospels into a single figure. The first was Mary Magdalene, the apostle. The second was Mary of Bethany, sister of Martha and Lazarus, mentioned in John chapter 11. The third was the unnamed sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet with perfumed oil, narrated in Luke chapter 7. Gregory, in a rhetorical maneuver that would be repeated for centuries, declared that these three women were the same person. And in doing so, he transformed Mary Magdalene the Apostle into the famous repentant sinner. This forgery, as crude as it was effective, dominated the Western Christian imagination for over 1,000 years. In iconography, Mary Magdalene came to be portrayed as a beautiful, semi-nude woman, weeping at Jesus' feet, often with a flask of perfume beside her, in an image that suggested past promiscuity and present redemption. This image, we must acknowledge, had a specific and cruel function. It served to reinforce the implicit message that women, when they stray from domestic chastity, are sexually sinful, and that their redemption depends on submissive repentance before the masculine figure of Christ. This theological scheme justified, for centuries, the marginalization of women from ecclesiastical structures. Women could not be priestesses because no woman had been an apostle. Mary Magdalene, the true first apostle, had been erased and replaced by a repentant sinner, whose model role was to kneel, weep, and submit. The erasure served very concrete institutional functions. Only in 1969 did the Vatican officially recognize the error. Discreetly, without fanfare, without asking for forgiveness, without acknowledging the historical damage caused, the liturgy was reformed to separate Mary Magdalene from the other two women with whom Gregory the Great had fused her. In 2016, Pope Francis elevated her to the status of Apostle of the Apostles, establishing her liturgical feast on July 22nd as a celebration of the same degree as other apostolic feasts. A belated but significant reparative action after more than 1,400 years of institutional defamation. Spinoza, in his time, did not have the texts of Nag Hammadi or the feminist studies that would flourish in the 20th century. But he had already perceived, just by reading the canonical Gospels with critical attention, the prominent position of Mary Magdalene and the discrepancy between this position and the subordinate role that had been assigned to her by ecclesiastical tradition. This type of discrepancy between what the original text said and what later institutions intended for them to have said was precisely the type of phenomenon that his method sought to detect. And it is one of the several instances in which the honest application of the method revealed, to the embarrassment of dogmatists, the difference between historical memory and ideological construction. When Spinoza died in February 1677, there were few serious readers who publicly identified as Spinozists. Anyone who dared to do so risked professional reputation, personal safety, often even their own freedom. Throughout the 18th century, being called a Spinozist was equivalent, in respectable European circles, to being called an atheist, libertine, subversive. The philosophers who read and appreciated Spinoza in secret, and there were many, avoided mentioning his name in their published works. They invented other references, other attributions, other intellectual pseudonyms, but they continued to read him. They continued to discuss him in private letters. They continued to think in his shadow. Among these subterranean heirs, special mention should be made of Pierre Bayle, the French scholar who took refuge in Rotterdam, who dedicated one of the longest entries in his historical and critical dictionary, published in 1697, to Spinoza. The entry is formally critical, to protect Bayle from accusations of heretical sympathy, but in practice presents Spinoza's theses in such a broad, detailed, and comprehensible manner that it functions as a true propaganda for Spinozist philosophy. All European intellectuals of the early 18th century read Bayle, and, through Bayle, they read Spinoza. Voltaire, Diderot, Hume, Rousseau, Kant, all the great names of the Enlightenment were, in some way, marked by the philosophy of the Dutch lens polisher. By the end of the 18th century, there was a decisive event in the reception of Spinoza, called by historians of German philosophy the Pantheismusstreit, or the controversy over pantheism. In 1785, the philosopher Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi published a letter to Moses Mendelssohn, in which he shockingly revealed that the great Lessing, one of the most admired German intellectuals of the Enlightenment, had confessed to him in private conversation that he was a Spinozist. The revelation exploded like a bomb in the cultured circles of Germany. Some posthumously denounced Lessing as heretical, others defended him. Others began to read Spinoza for the first time. discovering that what tradition had prescribed as atheism was, in fact, one of the deepest philosophies ever produced by the human spirit. Goethe, who had close ties with Jacobi and Mendelssohn, publicly declared himself a Spinozist. Schelling developed a philosophy of nature deeply indebted to Spinoza. Hegel recognized that being a Spinozist is a necessary beginning of all philosophy. In the 19th century, the influence multiplied. Coleridge, in Romantic England, absorbed Spinoza through the Germans. Marx read Spinoza carefully in his formative years, taking extensive notes that were later recovered by researchers. Nietzsche, in his famous letter to Overbeck in July 1881, wrote that he was as happy as he had ever been in his life because he had discovered a surprising predecessor in Spinoza, with whom he shared the view that knowledge is the strongest of passions, that morality is not transcendent but natural, and that there is a denial of free will that unified their two philosophies. In the 20th century, Einstein, when asked if he believed in God, gave the answer I have mentioned before, and that is worth repeating. I believe in the God of Spinoza, who reveals himself in the ordered harmony of what exists. This seemingly unpretentious phrase represents one of the most notable testimonies to the continued vitality of Spinozist philosophy. Einstein, the greatest physicist of the 20th century, the man who transformed our understanding of space, time, energy, and matter, found in Spinoza's formulation the most appropriate expression of his own religious feeling. Not the personal God of traditional religions, not the shallow atheism of reductionist materialists, but a deep reverence for the cosmic order, which is at the same time rational and mysterious, understandable in part and ultimately inexhaustible. And there are other contemporary names worth mentioning, because they show that Spinoza's influence is not only historical but alive, active, fermenting in today's thought. The French philosopher Gilles Deleuze wrote two magnificent books on Spinoza, presenting him as one of the most radical liberators of Western thought. The Portuguese neuroscientist Antonio Damasio dedicated an entire work, In Search of Spinoza, published in 2003, to showing how contemporary psychology of emotions confirms, in many ways, the philosopher's intuitions about the nature of human effects. The American philosopher Stuart Hampshire, in Oxford, published in the 1950s a monograph on Spinoza that is still considered one of the best introductions to his work in the English language. All of this reveals, viewer, something impressive. Spinoza did not only win as a historical figure, as a philosopher whose work is studied in universities. He won as an underground current, like a river flowing beneath the soil of civilizations, emerging here and there in unexpected springs, nourishing the most diverse plants, contributing to blooms that, at first glance, seem to have nothing to do with him. The critical method applied to sacred texts, the secularization of the state, the defense of freedom of thought, the understanding of religion as a historical and cultural phenomenon, the pantheistic intuition that finds expression in mystics, poets, scientists, the ethics of effects that influences modern psychology. All these currents, so seemingly diverse, draw directly or indirectly from the well that Spinoza opened in European soil in 1670, and this inevitably brings us back to the initial question of this investigation. What is the relationship between Spinoza and the historical Jesus? Why can a 17th century philosopher, writing in Latin in a room in The Hague, help us recover the voice of a 1st century rabbi speaking Aramaic in a village in Galilee? The answer, I believe, lies in a deep spiritual continuity. Both were, in their own way, dissidents of institutional religion in the name of a more genuine experience of the sacred. Both were persecuted, expelled, defamed by established authorities. Both left, as a legacy, a work that continued to ferment underground after their deaths, emerging in each generation to provoke new awakenings. And both, finally, pointed to something that traditional religions, in their most institutional moments, had tried to hide. That the divine is not the private property of any human institution, but is available infinitely to every being willing to seek it sincerely. We have reached, viewer, the end of this long journey. We have traversed together the canals of Amsterdam, the silent attics where a young Jew pored over ancient manuscripts, the warm streets of Galilee where a carpenter who refused to be silenced walked, the imperial halls of Nicaea where bishops voted on the identity of Christ, the deserts of Egypt where monks hid forbidden gospels in clay jars, the European squares where books were burned before silent crowds. We have made a long journey, and now as we say goodbye we need to say what at its core was the reason for this entire walk. If the historical Jesus and the Christ of the Church may not be the same person, as Spinoza taught us, this does not mean, as some hastily concluded, that everything is false, that everything is manipulation, that everything is empty. On the contrary, it means that the truth, the deepest truth, is somewhere we need to have the courage to seek beyond the layers of institutional construction. It means that faith, if it wishes to be authentic, must be willing to cross the fire of criticism, doubt, and honest historical research. A faith that flees from these questions is a fragile faith that protects itself to survive, but in protecting itself, loses what would make it truly alive. Spinoza did not destroy faith, he purified it, just as Jesus, 16 centuries earlier, did not destroy Judaism, but sought to purify it, to return it to its most genuine sources, to free it from the legalistic and political incrustations that had hardened it. There is a spiritual continuity between the two, which historical investigation makes increasingly evident. Both were radical reformers, working with the tools available in their times. Both recoiled from superstition and advanced toward the authentic experience of the sacred. Both paid a personal price for that courage. And if there is anything that should remain from this journey we have made together, viewer, it is the following. The divine is greater than any human institution has ever managed to capture in its catechisms, in its dogmas, in its councils. The divine is greater than any image painted on an altar, greater than any statue carved in marble, greater than any phrase written in a sacred book, even if that book is the most venerable. The institutions, the images, the formulas, the books are pointers. They are fingers pointing to the moon, but the finger is not the moon. And the greatest tragedy of historical religions, that tragedy that Jesus denounced in his campaigns against the scribes and Pharisees, and that Spinoza denounced in his fight against political theology, is the tragedy of confusing the finger with the moon, of worshipping the pointer instead of looking at what the pointer points to. When you leave this video, viewer, do not leave with anger. Do not leave with bitterness. Do not leave wishing to destroy the faith of others, who may still need institutional forms to orient themselves in the mystery. Leave, if possible, with a deeper compassion. Leave with a sharper intelligence. Leave with an inner freedom that you may not have had before. Leave knowing that you can read sacred texts with reverence and at the same time with critical lucidity. Leave knowing that you can hold on to what is true in them and let go of what is later construction. Leave knowing that this task of discernment is possible, is necessary, and is perhaps the most important spiritual task of our time. Because we live in a time when old certainties are dissolving, but in which there is also a new possibility, the possibility of an adult spirituality. A spirituality that does not need miracles to believe, a spirituality that does not need dogmas to stand, a spirituality that nourishes itself from the beauty of the world, the depth of human experience, the greatness of the great masters of the past, without needing to turn any of them into an idol. A spirituality that can, paradoxically, find Jesus in a more genuine way than centuries of institution ever could. Because by removing the imperial veils that were placed over his face, we discover underneath a real man, a man who touches us in a way that the golden icon did not touch, a man who bleeds, who cries, who gets angry, who loves, who doubts, who is afraid, and who, despite all this, or because of all this, chooses to tell the truth even when the truth leads him to the cross. This Jesus, viewer, is waiting for you, not on a celestial throne, not on a golden altar, not in a memorized creed, but on the margins of any gospel read with critical attention, in the folds of any prayer made without fear, in the depths of any human experience traversed with sincerity. This Jesus, that poor and courageous rabbi from Galilee, remains alive in those who have the courage, as he did, to utter the words that powers do not want to hear, and Spinoza, in some way, is the guide who leads us to him. With his polished lens, the Dutch philosopher helped us see through the veils. With his solitary courage, he showed us that the truth is worth the price. With his silent life, he reminded us that it is not the crowds that transform the world, but the few who, in rooms illuminated by a single candle, refuse to be silent. The historical Jesus and the Christ of the Church may not be the same person, as Spinoza taught us. But now, reaching the end of this long journey, perhaps we can add something that he, in the prudence of his time, could only suggest between the lines. Perhaps the historical Jesus, precisely because he is not the imperial Christ, is much closer to us, much more human, much more divine in the deepest sense of that word, because the divinity that Jesus embodied, that divinity that Spinoza sought to understand philosophically, is not the divinity of power, of throne, of empire. It is the divinity of love, of truth, of the courage to say what needs to be said, no matter the cost. And this divinity, viewer, is not confined to any church, to any temple, to any specific book. It is in you. It is in me. It is in each of those who, upon hearing this reflection, feel something move deep in their chest. Because, as Jesus himself said, according to the version preserved in the Gospel of Thomas, buried in the Egyptian desert, "Split the wood, and I am there. Lift the stone, and you will find me there." The sacred is greater than the institutions that tried to contain it. The sacred, in the end, is the very breath of the universe, and whoever had the courage, like Jesus, like Spinoza, to breathe freely, becomes, in that breath, a small incarnation of that greater freedom. Thank you for walking this far.